everybody. Continuing along with our graphing unit, our trig graphing unit, we're going to just be doing some practice today, so we're going to have a bunch of different problems that we're going to look at. So the do now says, which equation is represented by the graph shown below? Now, let's look at this graph here. First things first, we should identify if this is sine or cosine. Now, I know all the answer choices say cosine, so it's going to be cosine, but I want to look at why. Since it starts at above the midline, and then it goes down, up, and ends above, so since it has that U shape, that is why it's a cosine graph. If it started at the midline, went above, and then ended at the midline, that's when it would be a sine graph, but we don't have that now. So let's look at this. The number in front of cosine, this represents our amplitude. Okay, so remember our amplitude, that's the distance from midline to the max or min. So if we look here, this distance is 0.5. To write 0.5 in a different way is 1/2. So our amplitude should be 1/2. So that means 2 is out because it doesn't have an amplitude, and 4 is out because it says our amplitude is 2, not 1/2. So now let's look at the difference between 1 and 3. The difference is this 2. So if there's a number in front of x, that represents your frequency. Now, if you remember, the frequency is related to the period of the graph. Now, the period is the time it takes to complete one full cycle. Okay? Now, I outlined the full cycle in blue, and that ends at this point here, pi. So let's recall how we relate the frequency and the period. So we relate them with this formula here. Period equals 2 pi divided by the frequency. Okay, or 2 pi divided by b, sorry. So, in example number 1, b is 2. So let's see if that gives us pi. So p equals 2 pi divided by 2, because now we're looking at answer choice 1. These 2's will cross out, and we'll get that the period is pi, which is what we have from our graph. So that tells us that answer choice 1 is our answer. Okay, so just kind of let's review the components of a sinusoidal function. So we have A, B, and C. So A, as we mentioned before, represents the amplitude. Why don't I color code this? Let's make it all pretty. So A represents the amplitude, which I defined in the do now. B represents your frequency, which was also discussed in the do now. And C represents your midline. So that is the middle of your graph, and there is one other component that you can add to the midline to find it. So C is equal to the max plus the min divided by 2. So that's one formula that we did have for the midline. Moving right along. So what we're going to do here is we're going to practice writing sine and cosine functions. Okay, they're going to be giving us some information such as the amplitude, the midline, and the period or the frequency. And we're just going to be plugging them in to these forms depending on if it's sine or cosine. So an important thing here is you want to identify information that will help you identify A, B, and C. So let's look here. It says write a cosine function, that's important, that has an amplitude of 3, a midline at y equals negative 0.5, and a period of pi over 2. So there's 3 pieces of information, right? A, B, and C. Let's make sure we have all 3 of those components. So amplitude, they tell us, is 3. So A is 3. They tell us that the midline is at negative 0.5, so that is C, negative 0.5. And then they tell us the period is pi over 2. Be careful. B does not represent the period. It represents the frequency. So to find the frequency, we have to use the formula P equals 2 pi over B. We know the period is pi over 2. So we're plugging in P for the period. And now we have to solve for B. To solve for B here, we have a fraction equal to a fraction. That means we cross multiply. So we cross multiply here, and we get, I'm just going to move the work here, we get B times pi is equal to, and we cross multiply here, we do 2 times 2, which is 4, and we keep the pi as is. Now we want to get B by itself. That means we have to divide both sides by pi. When we do that, these pi's will cancel out, and also those will cancel out. So we're left with B is equal to 4. So B is 4. Now that we have all 3 pieces of information, we could plug them into our formula here. Remember, we're using cosine because they tell us it's a cosine function. So we get y equals A, we're putting 3 because the amplitude is 3. Then we have cosine. B was 4, the frequency, so 4x. Now C was a negative 0.5, so we're going to do negative 0.5. Now, if you would like, instead of writing 0.5, you can also write 1/2. It's up to you, whichever you would like. I'm going to keep it as 0.5 just because that's what the problem gave us. So negative 0.5. And this would be our function that we type into, or that we graph. All right, moving right along. Let's look at the second one. Just want to change the zoom here. Oh, Alexa, I was not talking to you. All right.
It looks like Amazon doesn't sell talking.
All right. So, moving right along. I don't know if you heard that, but my Amazon Alexa was just going off. So, for part B, it says write a sine function, that's important, that has a midline of 4, an amplitude of 2, and a period of 8. So those are our 3 important pieces of information. Now we need to identify A, B, and C. A is our amplitude. It says our amplitude is 2. B is our frequency. They don't tell us our frequency. They tell us our period. So I'm going to leave that out for a second. And then they tell us our midline is 4. So C is 4. Okay, so now to find B. We have to use the formula. The period is equal to 2 pi divided by B. They tell us our period is 8, so P is 8. So 8 is equal to 2 pi divided by B. Now, we can cross multiply here, but there's no fraction. So what you want to do is put this 8 over 1. So when you cross multiply, we have 8 times b. I'm going to bring the work up here, which is 8b is equal to, then you have 2 pi times 1, which is 2 pi. Now we still want to solve for b, so to do that we divide both sides by 8. This 8 will cancel. We're left with b is equal to. Now we have 2 over 8. We can actually simplify that. If you're comfortable with reducing fractions, you could do it that way, or you can also use your calculator. To use your calculator, you would type in 2, why don't I actually do it? It's going to take a little while to load because this app takes forever. So bear with me. Okay. So if you want to simplify the fraction and you don't know how to do it, you would do in your calculator alpha y equals enter. Then you would have 2 divided by 8. When you press enter, it will give you the simplified fraction. Notice I did not type pi into the calculator. If you type pi into the calculator, you're going to get a decimal because pi is irrational. We do not want a decimal. We want it in fraction form with pi in our answer. So this simplifies, we said, to 1 pi over 4. Now, normally you don't see a 1 in front, so it'll just simplify to pi over 4. So that tells us that b is pi over 4. Now let's plug this in. We have y equals, we have a sine function. So I'm going to scroll up and we're going to be using this one here. It's the same as the cosine, except it says sine. So we have y equals a, where a is 2. Then we have sine of b. b is pi over 4 x plus c, where c was 4. So there is our second equation. So now moving on to the third one. Just scroll down a little bit. It says write a sine function that has an amplitude of 2, a midline of 3, and a frequency of 1/2. So we need to find A, B, C. A is our amplitude is 2. Now, B is our frequency. Notice they gave us the frequency. They didn't give us the period. So we have even less work to do here. And C is our midline, which is 3. So now we have all 3 pieces of information. We can go straight into writing our formula, or our equation, sorry. So y equals, we have a sine function. So it's A, which is 2, sine of B, which was 1/2, x plus c, which is 3. And there is our equation. Okay, so we just practiced writing our equations for these types of problems. Moving right along. If we're asked to graph exactly one cycle, what you have to do is you have to find the period, like we were doing before. I'm going to flip back for a second using this formula. So using P equals 2 pi divided by B. Then you're going to make the period the 4th point on your x-axis, and then you graph as usual. Now you do this whenever the frequency is not 1, so when you have a B, if the frequency is 1, there's not much you have to do. So if frequency is 1, I'll just write this. So if frequency, or B, is 1, okay, the period is 2 pi. It will always be 2 pi if b is equal to 1. Moving forward, when graphing, you first graph your midline, C, then you graph using the amplitude, and then you adjust the period if needed. So that's when you have a b. So think about this. When graphing, you are calling a cab. Even though there's barely any cabs anymore, everyone just uses Uber. Even though when we were younger, we were told not to get into a stranger's car. And that's what everyone does nowadays. So think about calling a cab. Think about the good old days when we weren't in quarantine. So, getting to some practice. So it says graph exactly one cycle of this. Okay, so it says one cycle. That's how you know we have to use this procedure here, where we have to find the period. So, first thing we do, let's graph the midline. The midline, so why don't I just label them all? CAB, calling a cab. So our midline is 3. So let's graph that first. 1, 2, 3. So I like using a dotted line. If you want to use a solid line, you can, but I suggest using a dotted. Okay, so that is our midline. Next, we use our amplitude. You have to be very, very careful here. Our amplitude is 1. There is no number there, but there is that negative. Remember, this negative tells us to flip the graph over the midline. So let's see if I could jot that down somewhere. So the negative tells us to flip the graph over the midline. Okay, so the maxes are going to change to minimums, and the minimums will change to maximums. So what I like to do for these problems, again, if you don't like my process, you can do it another way. I like graphing the original function, and then I like switching it over. So sine always started at the midline, and then it would go up, and then it would go to the midline, and then it would go down, and then it would go to the midline. Since it has a negative, we actually have to switch the maximum to a minimum, and we have to switch the minimum to a maximum because of that negative that was there. So now that we practically have our graph, we have one last piece of information that we have to find, and that is b. So b is 1/2, but that doesn't help us. We need to find the period. So the period is equal to 2 pi divided by b. Since b is a fraction, I like writing it with a division symbol. So 2 pi divided by b was 1/2. The reason I like doing this is because we have to use keep, change, flip. So we keep 2 pi. We change this division to a multiplication, and then we flip that fraction. You can think of this as 2 pi over 1 if that helps you. 2 pi times 2, that gives you 4 pi, and then it's just over 1, so we can leave it as 4 pi. Now that we have this, we label the last point of our graph 4 pi, because that's how long it takes to complete one cycle. And then we're done. So very similar, we're just changing that last point. So let's look at this example. It says make an appropriate scale. I want to talk about that for a bit. And then it says graph exactly one cycle of this trigonometric function. Now, scaling. That happens on your y or your x-axis. That's what you go up by. So all of our examples up until this point, we went up by 1, 2, 3, and so on. That's not going to work all the time because you might not have enough space. So I'm going to show you what that's going to look like, but first let's identify all of our information. So let's identify C, A, and B because we're calling a cab. So our midline is -6, it's our C. Our amplitude is 8, and our frequency is 1 because there's no number in front of that x. This tells us that our period is 2 pi. So I'm going to go back for a second, right here. So if frequency is 1, period is 2 pi. Okay, so if you're copying down notes, which you should be, don't copy what I'm about to do. So first I'm going to go down by 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So let's say I made this my midline. That's 6, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. So let's say I made this my midline. If I were to try and graph this amplitude, which is 8, I can go 8 above, but I can't go 8 below. I don't have enough space. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I'd be off the graph. You can't graph off the graph and just kind of assume where 8 would be. So we have to scale. So instead of going up by 1s, I could try to go up by 2s, for instance. So let's say that this is -2, then we have -4, -6, and so on. -10, -12, -14, -16, and I'll stop there. And then on the positive y side, we have to do the same. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16. You can go all the way if you'd like. You don't have to write all these numbers, but you should write the scale so you're familiar with what you're going up by. Now, on our x-axis, we usually just go 4 points. So since this might be a little bit squished, I want to spread it out. So I'm going to make these our 4 points. Okay, I just want to spread it out a bit. You don't have to. If you want to go by one box, you can. But I just want to make the graph look a little bit more spread out for our one cycle. Okay, so let's start graphing. First thing we graph is the midline, which is -6. So that's right here. Okay. Next thing we use is our amplitude. Now this is a cosine graph, so I'm just going to kind of, on the side, if this is our midline, cosine goes above, midline, below, midline, above. So we have to start 8 above our midline, but we're going up by 2. So we have to go up 2, 4, 6, 8. And then we go to our midline. Then we go below 2, 4, 6, 8. Then we go to our midline. Then we go above 2, 4, 6, 8. Okay, I'm just going to erase this. And now we can connect our graph. So a nice smooth line. Okay, now the last thing we have to do is identify what this point is, which we did identify it already. It is 2 pi. So we have to label this as 2 pi. And that is one cycle with an appropriate scale. So we're going to continue on. So this one says graph this function over the domain. So we haven't seen a question like this before. This is telling you that your graph, so your x-axis, must go to 2 pi. So it has to start at 0 and end at 2 pi. I actually want to write that. I kind of like that explanation better. Your x-axis, or your graph, must start at 0 and end at 2 pi. So we might not be graphing one cycle. We might be graphing more than one cycle. So let's graph how we would. So we're calling a cab. So our midline in this example is 2. Our amplitude is 3. And our frequency is 2. Now remember, the frequency doesn't really help us. We need it to also find the period. So to find the period, we have to use the formula. Period equals 2 pi divided by the frequency. So the period is 2 pi divided by 2. The 2's will cross out, and we get that the period is pi. So the period is 4 points away from the origin, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4. Actually, I'm going to want to spread it out a bit, so I'm going to skip it by 2. You don't have to if you don't want to. But 1, 2, 3, 4, that's going to be pi. Now, that's not enough for us. We want to go to 2 pi. So what we actually have to do is, to get to 2 pi, is we have to go 4 more spaces. So we kind of have to count by pi. So 1, 2, 3, 4. If every 4 spaces is pi, that means that this space will be 2 pi. So we have to just keep graphing until we reach 2 pi. Okay, so let's graph now. C is 2, so that means our midline is 2. So here is our midline. Our amplitude is 3. Now we're graphing a sine graph. So sine goes midline, above, midline, below, midline. So we start at the midline. Now we use our amplitude. We have to go above 3. So 1, 2, 3. Then we go back to the midline. Then we have to go below 3. 1, 2, 3. Then we go back to the midline. So we've just finished, oh my gosh, that was horrible. We just finished one sine curve. But we're not done yet. We have to go to 2 pi. So we continue the same pattern. So we started at the midline, so the next point should be above. 1, 2, 3. Then we should go back to the midline. Next point should be below. 1, 2, 3. And then we go back to the midline. And then you continue the graph. All right, remember, sine and cosine, they repeat that same pattern over and over again. So that is what the graph would look like from 0 to 2 pi. Okay, so for your check for understanding, you have to graph one cycle of a cosine function with an amplitude 3, period pi over 2, midline y equals -1, and passing through the point 0, 2. Okay, so to get credit for this lesson, you have to complete this on a separate piece of paper showing all of your work, and you need to upload a picture of that work onto Google Classroom. Okay? All right, guys, have a great rest of your day.